The desert heat pressed down on Staff Sergeant Maria Santos like a heavy blanket as she limped through the abandoned village streets. Her left leg throbbed with each step, blood seeping through the makeshift bandage she had wrapped around the shrapnel wound hours earlier. The Taliban ambush had separated her from her unit, leaving her alone in hostile territory with nothing but her rifle, a half-empty canteen, and the desperate hope of finding friendly forces. Maria had been in Afghanistan for 8 months, serving as a combat medic with the 82nd Airborne Division. At 26, she had already seen more violence and suffering than most people would witness in a lifetime. But nothing had prepared her for the chaos of the morning's patrol gone wrong. The IED explosion had killed 2 of her team members instantly, and the subsequent firefight had scattered the survivors across the rocky terrain. She pressed herself against the crumbling wall of a mud brick building, listening for any signs of movement. The village appeared deserted, but appearances could be deadly in a war zone. Through her pain and exhaustion, Maria's training kicked in. She needed to find a secure position, treat her wound properly, and establish communication with her base. But first, she had to determine if she was truly alone. The sound of approaching vehicles made her heart race. Maria peered around the corner and spotted a convoy of armored Humvees rolling down the main street, their American flags visible through the dust clouds. Relief flooded through her as she recognized the distinctive gear and formation of a special operations unit. These weren't regular infantry soldiers. Their movements were too precise, their equipment too specialized. Lieutenant Commander Jake Morrison sat in the lead vehicle, his weathered face scanning the terrain through his rifle scope. At 34, he had led countless missions as part of SEAL Team 7, earning a reputation for tactical brilliance and unwavering dedication to his men. His team had been inserted into this sector to investigate reports of high-value Taliban targets operating from the region. Morrison's radio crackled with updates from his team members positioned throughout the convoy. Petty Officer First Class Rodriguez reported all clear from the rear vehicle, while Chief Petty Officer Thompson maintained overwatch from the gun turret. The mission parameters were straightforward: gather intelligence, identify enemy positions, and extract without engaging unless absolutely necessary. Maria made her decision. She stepped into the street, raising her rifle above her head in the universal gesture of a friendly force needing assistance. The lead vehicle slowed to a stop, and she could see the SEAL team members training their weapons on her position while assessing the potential threat. Morrison studied the figure through his scope. Female soldier, American uniform, obviously wounded. But something felt off. In his years of experience, spontaneous encounters in hostile territory often meant trouble. His gut instincts, honed by dozens of successful missions, were sending warning signals that he couldn't quite identify. Hold position, Morrison commanded over the radio. Single female soldier, appears wounded, requesting assistance. The team maintained their defensive posture while Morrison made the call. Standard operating procedure dictated that they verify the soldier's identity and assess the situation before offering aid. But the woman was clearly in distress, and leaving a wounded American behind was not an option any of them could live with. Maria approached slowly, keeping her hands visible and her movements non-threatening. She could see the tension in the SEAL team's body language and understood their caution. In a combat zone, even friendly encounters could turn deadly in seconds. Staff Sergeant Maria Santos, 82nd Airborne Division, she called out, her voice hoarse from dehydration and pain. My unit was hit by an IED this morning. I've been separated from my team and need immediate medical attention. Morrison lowered his rifle slightly, but kept his finger near the trigger. Something about the woman's story bothered him, though he couldn't pinpoint exactly what. Maybe it was the way she carried herself despite the obvious injury, or perhaps the fact that she had survived alone in enemy territory for several hours without being captured or killed. The SEAL team's medic, Hospital Corpsman Second Class Williams, had already prepared his medical kit. Williams was a veteran of 4 deployments and had saved more lives than he could count. He could see the blood on the woman's leg and recognized the signs of serious injury that required immediate attention. LT, she needs medical attention now, Williams reported. That wound looks like it could be arterial. If we don't treat her soon, she's going to bleed out. Morrison weighed his options quickly. The mission timeline was tight, and they couldn't afford delays. But they also couldn't abandon a wounded American soldier. His team was trained to adapt to changing circumstances, and humanitarian assistance fell within their operational guidelines. Rodriguez, Thompson, maintain security perimeter, Morrison ordered. Williams, provide medical assistance. Keep it quick and efficient. Maria felt her legs giving out as the adrenaline that had kept her moving finally began to fade. The combination of blood loss, dehydration, and exhaustion was taking its toll. She sank to one knee as Williams approached with his medical kit, grateful for the professional competence she saw in his movements. Williams began his assessment immediately, cutting away the makeshift bandage to examine the wound. The shrapnel had created a deep gash in Maria's thigh, and while it had missed the major arteries, it was still bleeding steadily. He applied a pressure bandage and started in 4-line to combat the dehydration and blood loss. You're lucky, Williams told her as he worked. Couple more hours, and this could have been a lot worse. What's your unit's last known position? Maria provided the coordinates of where her patrol had been ambushed, along with details about the Taliban force that had attacked them. The information was valuable intelligence that could help other American units avoid similar ambushes. Morrison listened to the conversation while continuing to scan the surrounding area. His unease was growing stronger, though he still couldn't identify the source. Everything about the encounter seemed legitimate. The woman's uniform, her knowledge of military protocols, her wound was obviously real. Yet something felt wrong. The village remained eerily quiet around them. No signs of civilian life, no sounds of normal daily activity. Even in a war zone, there were usually some indicators of human presence. Animals, distant voices, the smell of cooking fires. This place felt completely abandoned, as if everyone had fled recently. Sir, Chief Thompson's voice came over the radio from his overwatch position. I'm seeing some unusual disturbances in the dust patterns about 200 meters east. Could be recent vehicle movement. Morrison's tactical awareness shifted into high alert mode. Fresh vehicle tracks in this area could indicate Taliban presence, possibly setting up for an ambush. The timing of encountering the wounded soldier suddenly seemed too convenient. Williams, how much longer? Morrison asked, his voice tense with urgency. 5 more minutes to stabilize her for transport, Williams replied, working quickly to secure the 4-line and apply proper bandaging. Maria noticed the change in the team's demeanor and felt a chill that had nothing to do with her injuries. She had been in enough combat situations to recognize when soldiers sensed danger. Her own training kicked in as she scanned the area, looking for potential threats. The silence was broken by the distant sound of an engine starting. Morrison immediately recognized it as a motorcycle, a favorite mode of transportation for Taliban scouts and suicide bombers. The sound was coming from the direction of Thompson's reported disturbance. Contact possible, Morrison announced over the radio. All units, weapons ready. Williams, we need to move now. The medic quickly gathered his supplies while Maria struggled to her feet. The 4-bag would have to be carried during transport, and the temporary bandaging would have to suffice until they reached a more secure location. Rodriguez spotted the first motorcycle emerging from behind a building about 300 meters away. The rider was dressed in traditional Afghan clothing, but the way he was scanning the American position suggested military reconnaissance rather than casual travel. One motorcycle, single rider, observing our position, Rodriguez reported. Maintaining distance but clearly conducting surveillance. Morrison made the tactical decision to extract immediately. Whether the motorcycle rider was Taliban or simply a curious local, their presence had been compromised. The mission now shifted from intelligence gathering to force protection and getting the wounded soldier to safety. Mount up, we're moving out, Morrison commanded. Santos, you're riding with Williams in the second vehicle. As the SEAL team prepared to depart, Maria felt a growing sense of dread that went beyond the immediate tactical situation. There was something about this encounter that didn't feel right, something she couldn't quite articulate. Her instincts, developed through months of combat experience, were telling her that they were all walking into a trap. The convoy began moving again, with increased spacing between vehicles and heightened alert status. Morrison coordinated with his radio operator to report their situation to headquarters and request immediate intelligence updates on Taliban activity in their area of operations. Unknown to any of them, the motorcycle rider was already transmitting their position, vehicle count, and direction of travel to a larger Taliban force positioned along their planned route. The wounded soldier they had stopped to help was indeed Staff Sergeant Maria Santos, exactly as she had identified herself. But her presence in this specific location at this precise time was no accident. The Taliban had been tracking her unit for weeks, learning their patrol patterns and identifying vulnerabilities. The ambush that morning had been carefully planned not just to inflict casualties, but to create exactly this scenario. A wounded American soldier who would be found by other American forces, leading them into a larger trap. As the convoy moved through the narrow village streets, Maria realized with growing horror that she might have inadvertently led these brave men into mortal danger. The wound in her leg was real, her separation from her unit was genuine, but her rescue might have been orchestrated by an enemy that understood American values and would exploit their unwillingness to abandon wounded comrades. The first part of their ordeal was just beginning, and none of them yet understood the full scope of the danger they were about to face. The convoy had been moving for 20 minutes when Morrison's worst fears began to materialize. His radio operator, Petty Officer Second Class Chun, intercepted fragmented Taliban communications indicating increased activity in their sector. The enemy was mobilizing, and their conversations suggested they were tracking American forces. Maria sat in the second vehicle next to Williams, watching the medic monitor her vital signs while keeping one eye on the terrain outside. The four fluids were helping her regain strength, but the growing realization of what might be happening filled her with dread. She had spent enough time studying Taliban tactics to know they were capable of sophisticated psychological warfare. "Williams," she said quietly, not wanting to alarm the entire team over the radio. "I need to speak with your commanding officer. There's something about my situation that doesn't add up." The medic looked at her with concern. Combat stress could manifest in many ways, and wounded soldiers sometimes experienced paranoia or confusion. But there was clarity in Maria's eyes that suggested she was thinking tactically, not emotionally. "What's bothering you, Sergeant?" Williams asked, while continuing to check her bandaging. Maria took a deep breath, organizing her thoughts carefully. "My unit's patrol route this morning wasn't random. We were following up on intelligence about a Taliban weapons cache. The ambush site was perfectly positioned, like they knew exactly where we'd be and when." Williams frowned. Taliban forces had demonstrated increasing sophistication in their operations, but the level of coordination Maria was describing suggested something more organized than typical insurgent activity. He keyed his radio to Morrison's frequency. "LT, Santos has some tactical concerns about her situation. Requests to speak with you directly." Morrison's voice came back immediately. "Put her through." Maria took the radio handset, her military training overriding her physical discomfort. "Sir, Staff Sergeant Santos. I believe my unit may have been deliberately separated to create exactly this scenario. The Taliban have been studying our response patterns, and they know we won't abandon wounded personnel." The implications of her statement hit Morrison like a physical blow. If Maria was correct, then his entire team had been maneuvered into a predetermined kill zone. The Taliban were using American values and military doctrine against them, turning their strength into a vulnerability. "Explain your reasoning, Sergeant," Morrison commanded, his voice remaining calm despite the gravity of the situation. Maria outlined her analysis quickly but thoroughly. Her unit had received intelligence from a source that had proven reliable in the past, directing them to investigate a specific location at a specific time. The ambush had been perfectly executed, with escape routes blocked and rally points compromised. Most telling of all, she had been left alive, and mobile when killing her would have been simple. "Sir, I think I'm bait," Maria concluded. "And I think we're all being led into a larger trap." Morrison's mind raced through tactical possibilities. If Maria's assessment was correct, they needed to change their route immediately and call for extraction. But they were already committed to a narrow mountain pass with limited alternatives, and requesting immediate air support would take time they might not have. Chief Thompson's voice crackled over the radio from his position in the lead vehicle. "LT, I'm seeing multiple heat signatures on the thermal scope. Ridge line, approximately 1,000 meters ahead." Estimate 6 to 8 personnel in defensive positions. The confirmation of enemy presence ahead validated Maria's fears. Morrison immediately ordered the convoy to halt while he assessed their tactical options. They were caught between known threats ahead and potential pursuit from behind, in terrain that favored defensive positions over mobile forces. Rodriguez reported from the rear vehicle that the motorcycle they had spotted earlier was now accompanied by 2 additional vehicles maintaining a distant but consistent following position. The Taliban were boxing them in, just as Maria had predicted. All units, prepare for contact, Morrison announced. We have confirmed enemy positions ahead and potential pursuit behind. Switching to Evasion Protocol Delta, the SEAL team began implementing their contingency plans with the precision that came from hundreds of hours of training. Chen worked to establish communication with their headquarters while the vehicle operators identified potential alternative routes. Williams continued treating Maria while preparing for the possibility of combat medical operations. Maria felt the weight of responsibility settling on her shoulders. These elite soldiers were in danger because they had stopped to help her, and the knowledge that she might have been used as bait made her feel complicit in their predicament. But wallowing in guilt would serve no purpose. Her combat experience and local knowledge could be assets if she focused on the tactical situation. Lieutenant Commander, she said, using Morrison's formal rank to emphasize the seriousness of her input. There's a wadi about 2 kilometers south of our position. It's too narrow for vehicle pursuit, but it leads to an old Soviet firebase that might provide defensive advantages. Morrison studied his tactical map, locating the dried riverbed Maria had identified. The route would require abandoning their vehicles and moving on foot through difficult terrain, but it would also eliminate the Taliban's ability to use superior numbers and heavy weapons against them. The sound of approaching helicopters temporarily raised hopes for immediate air support, but Chen quickly identified them as enemy aircraft, older Soviet models that the Taliban had somehow acquired and modified. The situation was deteriorating rapidly, with the enemy demonstrating capabilities that exceeded their usual operational capacity. Sir, Thompson reported, the forward positions are repositioning. Looks like they're preparing to funnel us into a specific corridor. Classic L-shaped ambush formation. Morrison made the tactical decision that would define their survival chances. All units, prepare to abandon vehicles. We're going cross-country on foot. Grab essential equipment only, ammunition, medical supplies, communications gear. The team began rapidly redistributing their equipment for foot movement. Williams faced the challenge of keeping Maria mobile while carrying his medical kit and combat gear. The 4-line would have to be discontinued, and Maria would need to walk on her injured leg despite the pain and weakness. As they prepared to leave the relative safety of their armored vehicles, Chen managed to establish contact with their headquarters. The news was not encouraging. The Taliban had launched coordinated attacks across the region, stretching American forces thin and making immediate extraction impossible. Closest friendly forces are 6 hours out, Chen reported. Air support is engaged elsewhere, but they're trying to divert a Predator drone for overwatch. 6 hours was a lifetime in combat, especially when facing an enemy that had demonstrated superior local knowledge and tactical preparation. Morrison's team would need to find a defensive position and hold it against potentially overwhelming odds. Maria struggled to her feet as Williams removed the 4-line, fighting waves of dizziness from blood loss and dehydration. The pain in her leg was intense, but she had endured worse during her military training. More importantly, she had information about the local terrain that could save all their lives. The wadi I mentioned, she told Morrison as they prepared to move out. There are caves along the eastern wall, about halfway to the old firebase. My unit used them for observation posts. They're defensible and have multiple escape routes. Morrison nodded, incorporating her local knowledge into his tactical planning. Having a wounded team member would slow them down, but Maria's familiarity with the terrain might compensate for that disadvantage. The team moved out in tactical formation, with Thompson taking point and Rodriguez providing rear security. Morrison stayed close to Maria, ready to provide assistance while maintaining command control. Williams carried extra medical supplies, knowing that their situation was likely to get worse before it got better. The Afghan terrain was unforgiving, rocky, steep, and exposed. Every step was visible to potential observers on the surrounding ridges, and the team had to balance speed with security in their movement. The sound of gunfire in the distance suggested that other American units were also under attack, confirming that this was part of a larger Taliban offensive. As they reached the Wadi Maria had identified, the tactical situation became clearer. The dried riverbed provided concealment from direct observation, but it also created a natural choke point that could be used against them. Morrison had to trust Maria's assessment that the benefits outweighed the risks. The caves she had mentioned were exactly where she had indicated, carved into the rock face by centuries of water erosion. They were large enough to provide shelter for the entire team while offering multiple firing positions to defend against attack. More importantly, they connected to a network of passages that could provide escape routes if their position became untenable. Morrison established a defensive perimeter while Williams set up a casualty collection point in the deepest part of the cave system. Chun worked to improve their communication situation, using the rock formations to amplify their radio signals and maintain contact with headquarters. As the team settled into their defensive position, Maria finally had time to process the full implications of their situation. The Taliban had orchestrated an elaborate trap using her as bait, but they had underestimated both her tactical awareness and the capabilities of the SEAL team. The enemy might have superior numbers and local advantage, but they were about to face some of the most highly trained soldiers in the American military. The first probing attacks began just as the sun started to set, with Taliban fighters testing the team's defensive positions and response times. Morrison's men responded with disciplined fire, conserving ammunition while demonstrating their defensive capabilities. The message was clear: this would not be an easy target. But as darkness fell and the Taliban attacks intensified, all of them realized that their real ordeal was just beginning. The enemy had planned this operation carefully, and they would not be deterred by initial resistance. The night would test everything the SEAL team had learned about combat, survival, and the bonds that held military units together under extreme stress. The Taliban attacks came in waves throughout the night, each one more coordinated than the last. Morrison had faced many combat situations during his career, but the level of tactical sophistication displayed by their attackers was unlike anything he had encountered from insurgent forces. These weren't desperate fighters with improvised weapons. They moved with military precision and appeared to have detailed knowledge of SEAL team tactics. Maria huddled in the deepest part of the cave system, her rifle ready despite her injuries. Williams had done excellent work stabilizing her condition, but she was still weak from blood loss and the stress of their situation. What troubled her more than her physical condition was the growing certainty that this entire scenario had been planned from the beginning. During a brief lull in the fighting, she approached Morrison with information that could change everything. "Sir, I need to tell you something about the intelligence that led to my unit's patrol this morning." Morrison kept his eyes on the cave entrance while listening. "Go ahead, Sergeant." "The source that provided the information about the weapons cache," Maria said carefully. "He was new, brought to us by our Afghan interpreter about 2 weeks ago. Said he had inside information about Taliban supply routes." The implication hit Morrison immediately. If the intelligence source was compromised or working for the Taliban, then Maria's unit hadn't been ambushed by chance. They had been deliberately led into a trap. More disturbing was the possibility that the enemy had been planning this specific scenario for weeks. "Did your interpreter vouch for this source personally?" Morrison asked. Maria's expression darkened. "That's what's bothering me, sir. Our regular interpreter was supposedly sick that day. The man who brought the source was a replacement we'd never worked with before." Thompson's voice interrupted their conversation. "LT, movement on the ridge line. Looks like they're bringing up heavier weapons. I can see what appears to be a mortar tube." The tactical situation was deteriorating rapidly. Mortars would allow the Taliban to attack their position without exposing themselves to return fire, and the cave system that protected them from direct assault would become a death trap if they couldn't move freely. Chin had been working continuously to maintain communication with headquarters, but the news continued to be discouraging. "Sir, command reports that Taliban forces have launched attacks on 3 separate American positions tonight. All available air support is committed to other operations." Morrison felt the weight of command responsibility settling on his shoulders. His team was facing a well-planned enemy operation with no immediate prospect of rescue, while protecting a wounded soldier who might have been used to lure them into this situation. Every decision he made would determine whether his men survived the night. Rodriguez spotted the first mortar rounds being prepared about 800 meters from their position. The Taliban fighters were setting up their weapons with professional competence, suggesting they had training beyond typical insurgent capabilities. The first rounds would be ranging shots, followed by a sustained bombardment designed to force the Americans out of their defensive position. "All units, prepare for indirect fire," Morrison announced. "When the mortars start, we move to secondary positions deeper in the cave system." Williams gathered his medical supplies and prepared to move Maria if necessary. Her wound had been bleeding again from the stress and movement, and she was showing signs of shock despite the 4 fluids she had received earlier. In a hospital, her injuries would require surgery, but in their current situation, field medicine would have to suffice. The first mortar round exploded about 50 meters short of their position, sending rock fragments flying through the cave entrance. The Taliban were walking their rounds in, adjusting their aim based on the explosion patterns. Morrison's team had perhaps 2 minutes before the bombardment became accurate enough to threaten their position. Maria struggled to her feet, determined not to be a burden during their movement to the deeper caves. The pain in her leg was excruciating, but she had endured worse during military training. More importantly, she was beginning to remember details about the cave system that might save all their lives. "Lieutenant Commander," she called out as another mortar round exploded closer to their position. "These caves connect to an old Soviet ammunition depot. There might be supplies there, and definitely another exit." Morrison had to make an immediate decision. Moving deeper into an unknown cave system during a mortar attack was risky, but staying in their current position was becoming impossible. The third mortar round exploded just outside the cave entrance, filling the air with dust and making it difficult to breathe. "Move now," Morrison commanded. "Thompson, take point. Rodriguez, rear security. Williams, stay with Santos." The team moved through the narrow passages with tactical precision despite the challenging conditions. Their night vision equipment helped navigate the darkness, but the irregular rock formations and loose debris made movement dangerous even without enemy fire. As they progressed deeper into the cave system, Maria's memory of the area began returning more clearly. Her unit had explored these caves during a previous patrol, mapping the passages and identifying potential tactical advantages. The Soviet ammunition depot she had mentioned was real, abandoned decades ago, but possibly still containing useful supplies. The sound of voices echoing through the cave system made everyone freeze. Taliban fighters had entered the outer caves and were searching for the American position. Their voices carried clearly through the rock passages, and it was obvious they had some knowledge of the cave layout. Morrison signaled for absolute silence as the team took defensive positions in a natural chamber about 200 meters from the entrance. The voices were getting closer, and it sounded like at least a dozen fighters were conducting a systematic search of the cave system. Williams checked Maria's condition while they waited in the darkness. Her pulse was weak but steady, and she was fighting to stay conscious despite her injuries. The stress of their situation was taking a toll on her already compromised physical condition. Chun worked quietly to maintain radio contact with headquarters, but the rock formations were interfering with their communications. Occasional fragments of transmissions suggested that the broader Taliban offensive was continuing, with American forces across the region engaged in heavy fighting. The first Taliban fighters appeared at the chamber entrance just as Thompson was preparing to engage them. The narrow passage created a natural choke point that favored the defenders, but it also meant they were trapped if the enemy brought superior firepower to bear. Morrison made the tactical decision to engage immediately before the Taliban could organize a coordinated assault. Thompson's suppressed rifle dropped the lead fighter silently, but the sound of the body falling alerted the others to the American position. What followed was a violent firefight in near-total darkness, with muzzle flashes providing the only illumination. The SEAL team's superior training and equipment gave them an advantage, but they were constrained by their need to protect Maria and conserve ammunition for what could be a prolonged engagement. Rodriguez held the rear entrance to the chamber while Thompson and Morrison engaged the main Taliban force. Williams positioned himself to protect Maria while maintaining his ability to provide medical support if any of the team was wounded. The Taliban fighters showed more tactical discipline than Morrison expected from typical insurgent forces. They used covering fire and movement techniques that suggested military training, and their weapons were well maintained and properly employed. These were not desperate fighters with outdated equipment. They were professionals conducting a planned operation. After 20 minutes of intense fighting, the Taliban withdrew to regroup. Morrison used the respite to assess his team's situation. They had expended nearly 30% of their ammunition. Thompson had taken a minor wound to his arm, and their position was now known to the enemy. "We can't hold this position indefinitely," Morrison told his team. "They'll either bring up heavier weapons or try to collapse the cave entrance." Maria had been listening to the Taliban radio communications during the firefight, using her limited knowledge of local languages to gather intelligence. What she heard confirmed her worst fears about their situation. "Sir," she said quietly, "they're not just trying to kill us. I heard them talking about taking prisoners. They want to capture American Special Operations personnel for propaganda purposes." The implications were chilling. Being taken alive by the Taliban meant torture, filmed executions, and a propaganda victory that would damage American morale worldwide. Morrison's team would fight to the last man before allowing themselves to be captured, but the knowledge that death might be preferable to capture added another layer of stress to their situation. As they prepared to move deeper into the cave system toward the old Soviet depot Maria had mentioned, all of them realized that their ordeal was far from over. The Taliban had committed significant resources to this operation, suggesting it was part of a larger strategy aimed at inflicting maximum damage on American forces. The night was still young, and their enemies were patient, well-equipped, and determined to see their plan through to completion. The SEAL team's survival would depend on their ability to turn the Taliban's own tactics against them, using superior training and tactical flexibility to overcome the enemy's advantages in numbers and local knowledge. But first, they had to reach the Soviet ammunition depot and hope that decades-old supplies might provide the tools they needed to escape from what was becoming an increasingly desperate situation. The Soviet ammunition depot lay hidden behind a concealed entrance that Maria remembered from her unit's previous exploration. As Morrison's team approached the location, the weight of their desperate situation pressed down on everyone. They had been fighting for 6 hours, ammunition was running low, and Taliban forces continued to probe their positions with increasing aggression. Maria's condition had deteriorated despite William's excellent medical care. Blood loss and shock were taking their toll, but her mind remained sharp enough to guide them through the complex cave system. Her knowledge of the terrain had already saved their lives multiple times, and now their survival might depend on what they found in the abandoned Soviet facility. Thompson used his night vision equipment to examine the steel door that blocked their access to the depot. Decades of moisture and time had corroded the metal, but the structure appeared intact. More importantly, there were no signs that Taliban forces had discovered this location during their previous searches of the cave system. "Looks like we can breach this," Thompson reported to Morrison. "The hinges are corroded enough that we might be able to force it without explosives." The team worked together to open the heavy door, using their combined strength and tactical equipment to overcome decades of rust and debris. The metallic groaning echoed through the cave system, but the sound was muffled enough that it was unlikely to alert their pursuers. Inside the depot, their flashlights revealed exactly what Maria had hoped to find. Wooden crates lined the walls, marked with Cyrillic text indicating ammunition, explosives, and other military supplies. The Soviet forces had abandoned this position hastily during their withdrawal from Afghanistan, leaving behind substantial quantities of material. Chen immediately began checking the depot for additional radio equipment that might improve their communication situation. The Soviet-era gear was obsolete, but any functioning radio could potentially reach frequencies that the Taliban weren't monitoring. Williams continued monitoring Maria's vital signs while the team explored their new position. Her pulse was weak but stable, and she was fighting to stay conscious despite her injuries. The stress of their situation was pushing her body beyond its normal limits, but her determination to help the team remained unwavering. Morrison quickly assessed the tactical value of their discovery. The ammunition was decades old, but appeared properly stored, meaning it might still be functional. More importantly, the depot had two separate entrances, giving them options for movement that the Taliban hadn't anticipated. Rodriguez discovered crates containing Soviet-era explosives, including plastic charges that could be used for demolition or creating diversionary explosions. The material appeared stable, though using decades-old explosives would involve considerable risk. "Sir," Thompson called from the rear of the depot, "there's another passage back here. Looks like it leads toward the old firebase," Santos mentioned. The firebase represented their best hope for a defensive position that could hold out until American reinforcements arrived. If they could reach it and establish a perimeter, they might be able to survive long enough for the broader tactical situation to change in their favor. But first, they had to deal with the immediate threat of Taliban forces continuing to search the cave system. The enemy had demonstrated patience and tactical discipline, systematically clearing each passage and chamber. Eventually, they would find the depot entrance. Maria struggled to her feet as the team prepared to move again. The pain in her leg was constant now, but she was determined not to slow them down any further. Her knowledge of the terrain had already proven invaluable, and she might have additional information that could save their lives. "Lieutenant Commander," she said, approaching Morrison with obvious effort. "The passage to the firebase goes through a natural choke point about halfway there. If we can set charges there after we pass through, we can prevent pursuit." Morrison nodded, already thinking through the tactical implications. Using the Soviet explosives to collapse part of the cave system would cut off their escape route, but it would also prevent the Taliban from following them. The risk was acceptable given their alternatives. Thompson and Rodriguez quickly gathered the most useful supplies from the depot: ammunition that matched their weapons, explosives for the planned demolition, and medical supplies that Williams could use to treat Maria's worsening condition. Everything else would have to be left behind. As they prepared to move toward the firebase, Chen managed to establish brief contact with their headquarters. The news was mixed. American air support was finally becoming available, but it would be dawn before any aircraft could reach their position. They had to survive another 4 hours against an enemy that showed no signs of giving up. The passage to the firebase was exactly as Maria had described: narrow, winding, and defensible. The team moved carefully, with Thompson maintaining point security and Rodriguez watching their rear for signs of Taliban pursuit. Every sound echoed through the rock formations, making it difficult to determine if they were being followed. Halfway through the passage, they reached the choke point Maria had identified. The tunnel narrowed to barely shoulder width for about 20 meters, creating a natural bottleneck that could be easily defended or completely blocked with explosives. Morrison made the decision to set the charges immediately, before Taliban forces could discover their route. Rodriguez worked quickly with the Soviet demolitions, setting multiple charges with timers that would give them sufficient time to reach the firebase before the tunnel collapsed. Williams helped Maria through the narrow passage, supporting her weight while protecting her injured leg from the rough rock surfaces. Her condition was deteriorating rapidly, and she needed medical attention that exceeded what could be provided in the field. The firebase emerged from the darkness exactly as Maria had described: a Soviet-era fortification built into the mountainside, with commanding views of the surrounding terrain. The concrete structures had weathered decades of abandonment, but the basic defensive positions remained intact. Morrison immediately began organizing a defensive perimeter, positioning his men to take advantage of the natural and man-made fortifications. The firebase had been constructed by military engineers who understood defensive warfare, and its positions could be held by a small force against much larger numbers. Chen set up their radio equipment in the most protected part of the firebase, finally achieving reliable communication with their headquarters. The news was encouraging. A special operations aviation unit was preparing for immediate extraction, with arrival estimated at first light. The sound of explosions echoing through the cave system confirmed that Rodriguez's demolition charges had functioned as planned. The tunnel collapse would prevent direct Taliban pursuit, but it also meant the team was committed to holding their current position until extraction arrived. As dawn approached, Morrison's team prepared for what might be their final battle. The Taliban had demonstrated remarkable persistence and tactical capability throughout the night, and they would not simply abandon their operation because of a collapsed tunnel. Other routes to the firebase existed, and the enemy would find them. Maria lay on a makeshift stretcher that Williams had created from salvaged materials, her consciousness fading in and out as her body fought against shock and blood loss. In her lucid moments, she provided final pieces of tactical information that helped Morrison position his defensive positions for maximum effectiveness. The first Taliban probe came just as the sun cleared the eastern ridges, with enemy scouts testing the perimeter defenses and looking for weaknesses. Morrison's team responded with measured fire, conserving ammunition while demonstrating their defensive capabilities. But as the morning progressed and the Taliban attacks intensified, the sound of approaching helicopters finally broke the tension that had gripped them throughout the night. American Apache gunships appeared over the ridgeline, their weapons systems already engaging Taliban positions in the surrounding terrain. The extraction helicopters followed minutes later, landing in the firebase courtyard under protective fire from the gunships. Morrison's team moved quickly to load Maria aboard the lead aircraft while maintaining defensive positions until the last possible moment. As the helicopters lifted off with all personnel safely aboard, Morrison looked down at the fortress where they had made their stand. The Taliban operation had been sophisticated and well-planned, but it had ultimately failed because they had underestimated both American tactical flexibility and the bonds that held military units together under extreme stress. Maria was immediately transferred to the aircraft's medical station, where flight medics began the advanced treatment she needed to survive. Her injuries were serious, but manageable, and her tactical intelligence during the night had probably saved all their lives. During the flight to the base hospital, Morrison reflected on the lessons learned from their ordeal. The Taliban had demonstrated new levels of tactical sophistication and psychological warfare, using American values against them in ways that required immediate attention from intelligence analysts and tactical planners. But they had also demonstrated that even the most carefully planned enemy operations could be defeated by superior training, tactical flexibility, and the kind of courage that Maria Santos had shown throughout their ordeal. The wounded soldier who had walked into their lives had indeed brought danger, but she had also brought the knowledge and determination that ultimately ensured their survival. The SEAL team would return to combat operations after debriefing and recovery, but they would carry with them a new appreciation for the complexity of modern warfare and the importance of never underestimating either their enemies or their own capabilities. Maria Santos would recover from her physical wounds and return to duty, but the psychological scars of being used as bait in an elaborate enemy trap would take longer to heal. The knowledge that her presence had endangered elite soldiers would weigh on her, even though her tactical contributions during their escape had been essential to their survival. The Taliban operation had failed in its immediate objectives, but it had succeeded in demonstrating new capabilities that would require American forces to adapt their tactics and procedures. The war in Afghanistan continued to evolve, with each side learning from their encounters and developing new methods of gaining tactical advantage. In the end, the encounter between a wounded female soldier and a SEAL team had become a perfect example of how modern warfare tests not just military capabilities, but the human bonds and moral principles that define what soldiers fight to protect. They had all survived because they had refused to abandon each other, even when doing so might have been the tactically safer choice.